In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried in the land. Now prepare yourselves. The mud was the color of rust and regret, a thick, cloying paste that clung to Victoria Vance's immaculate Italian leather boots. Each step from her climate-controlled SUV to the newly poured concrete of the demonstration platform was a negotiation with a world she was actively trying to render obsolete. The mud was an affront, a smear of the primitive, chaotic earth upon her sterile, calculated universe. She stood now on her dais, a high priestess of progress in a temple of automated agriculture. The vast, emerald green fields of the Vance Agri-Tech demonstration farm stretching out before her like a conquered province. Her audience, a carefully curated clutch of investors in sharp, dark suits that seemed to absorb the humid Nebraska sunlight, listened with the rapt attention of true believers. She was not just selling them machinery, she was selling them the future, a future of crop yields predicted by algorithms, of harvests executed by silent, electric machines, a future free from the unpredictability of human hands and the whims of nature. Across the hangar, leaning on his mop as if it were the only thing holding him upright, Silas was just part of the scenery. A ghost in grease-stained coveralls, his presence was a lingering artifact of the past she was promising to erase. He watched her gesture with manicured hands toward the sky, where the flagship of her new world order, the drone named Harvester 1, hung motionless in the thick air, a $100,000 insect awaiting a command from its god. The X-17 drone is not just a machine, Victoria declared, her voice crisp and amplified, cutting through the low hum of the hangar's ventilation systems. It is the end of inefficiency, the end of guesswork, the end of manual labor. Her eyes, cold and blue as a winter sky, flicked past Silas for a fraction of a second, but the dismissal was so complete it felt like a physical blow. In that glance, he was not a man. He was a problem that had already been solved. He felt the familiar ache in his right hip, a dull, deep throb that always worsened with the coming of a storm. He could smell it in the air, ozone and wet earth, a scent that for him was more a memory than a sensation, a premonition encoded in his very bones. The scent of a sky about to turn violent. The investors, however, smelled only money. They saw the drone, the gleaming hangar, the perfect, unblemished rows of corn, and they saw a world finally brought to heel, a world that could be managed on a spreadsheet. Then Victoria's gaze dropped to her boots. A wrinkle of pure disgust marred the perfect, Botoxed landscape of her brow. The mud, the stain of the old world. She snapped her fingers, a sound as sharp and precise as a breaking circuit board. She did not look at Silas, but at a spot on the floor near his worn work boots, a point in space she expected him to occupy. "You, maintenance, my boots." It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the casual, unthinking authority of someone who had never been denied anything in her life, for whom the world was divided into those who command and those who obey. A few of the investors shifted, their bespoke suits rustling, a flicker of discomfort quickly suppressed. This, too, was part of the demonstration, absolute control. Silas felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the humidity. He was 67 years old. His hands, though gnarled with arthritis and scarred by a lifetime of work, had once coaxed life from stubborn soil and guided powerful machines through treacherous skies. They had held his father's hand as he passed, and they had built a life from nothing but dirt and determination. Now, they were being commanded to wipe away filth from the shoes of a child who saw him as less than the machines she worshipped. Fate has a cruel way of giving us exactly what we need at the moment we least expect it. He shuffled forward, the old injury in his hip making his limp more pronounced than usual. He took a clean rag from his cart, his movements slow, deliberate. He knelt, the concrete biting into his worn kneecaps, and began to wipe the mud from the boots of the woman who was young enough to be his granddaughter. As his rough knuckles brushed against the supple, expensive leather, he heard her continue her sermon, her voice dripping with a condescension so profound it was almost an art form. "You see, gentlemen, the future has no place for this kind of filth. Everything will be clean, perfect, untouched by human hands." The investors nodded, their eyes fixed on the gleaming drone, not on the old man on his knees in the shadow of their progress. Silas kept his head down, focusing on the task, on the rhythmic sweep of the rag. To look up would be to show them the storm gathering not just on the horizon, but in his own soul. He had become a ghost long ago, but even ghosts can feel the sting of humiliation. The question was, what does it take to make a ghost come back to life? The sky, which had been a placid, indifferent blue moments before, began to curdle. On the western horizon, dark, bruised clouds gathered with an unnatural speed, the leading edge of a classic Midwest squall line, a meteorological battering ram. Silas felt it first, a subtle but distinct change in the atmospheric pressure, a familiar heaviness that settled deep in his bones and made the metal plates in his hip ache with a phantom cold. The wind, once a gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of corn tassels, began to whip and moan around the corners of the massive, state-of-the-art hangar. It was an ancient, angry sound. He stood up slowly, the soiled rag still clutched in his hand, his eyes no longer on Victoria's now immaculate boots, but on the darkening sky. He saw what the investors and even Victoria, in her hermetically sealed reality, could not. He saw the tops of the distant cottonwood trees thrashing, their silver-green leaves turning their pale undersides up in unison, a farmer's tell for a truly bad blow. It was a sign not of rain, but of violence. Victoria, lost in the symphony of her own voice, and the hypnotic data streams on the monitors behind her, initially ignored it. Our proprietary software, AgriMind, analyzes wind speed, humidity, and soil moisture in real time to ensure perfect payload delivery. She trailed off as a savage gust of wind slammed against the hangar's corrugated metal walls with a deafening boom, a sound like a freight train derailing just outside. The investors flinched, murmuring amongst themselves, their confident gazes turning nervously toward the sky. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in as many seconds, the air suddenly tasting of iron. Rain began to fall, not in gentle drops, but in thick, wind-driven sheets that instantly blurred the landscape into a gray, churning watercolor. The world outside the hangar's massive bay doors ceased to be a manicured farm and became a primal chaos. On the massive monitor inside the sterile control room, the crisp, clean data stream from Harvester 1 began to bleed. Green numbers representing optimal conditions turned a cautionary yellow, then a panicked, screaming red. Signal integrity failing. A young, clean-cut engineer named Bryce muttered, his fingers flying across a keyboard with a frantic energy that betrayed his growing terror. His meticulously cultivated confidence from the start of the demo had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat on his brow. The microdoppler radar is getting scrambled by the precipitation density. The LiDAR can't penetrate the rain. It's flying blind. Put it on auto-return, Bryce. Now, Victoria snapped, her polished corporate voice losing its edge, cracking like thin ice. I'm trying. The GPS is bouncing all over the grid. The storm's messing with the satellite link. It's lost its orientation lock. It doesn't know which way is home. Outside, the $100,000 drone was no longer a symbol of precise, futuristic control. It was a toy in a tempest. It bucked and shuddered, a marionette with its strings cut, drifting sideways, inexorably, toward a row of high-voltage power lines that sizzled and spat at the edge of the property. Their arcs of blue electricity a stark warning against the bruised sky. As if to punctuate the disaster, another drone from the fleet, a newer $250,000 model still tethered to its charging station, was torn from its moorings by a cyclonic gust. It cartwheeled across the concrete with terrifying speed before smashing into a steel support beam with a sickening crunch of carbon fiber and shattered electronics. The investors gasped, one of them instinctively checking his watch as if he could calculate the exact moment his investment had turned to scrap. "Do something," Victoria shrieked, her composure shattering completely. Her face was a pale mask of horror, her eyes wide with the terror of watching millions of dollars of her father's investment and her own carefully constructed reputation being torn to shreds by the raw, untamable power of nature. The main screen was now a chaotic mess of cascading error codes and blinking red warnings. The drone was a ghost, a phantom blip on a dying feed, fighting a losing battle against a force its software couldn't comprehend, let alone control. The lead drone, Harvester 1, was now less than 100 yards from the power lines, its powerful rotors screaming in a desperate, high-pitched whine against the gale. Another minute, and it wouldn't just be a write-off. It would be a fireball, a spectacular, very public failure. The storm was no longer just a storm, it was a judgment. And the verdict it was delivering was that their perfect, sterile future was a fragile, expensive lie. The hook was set, not in the sky, but in the gut of every person who had believed the hype. They were about to learn the difference between a simulation and reality. The control room had devolved into a cacophony of panicked shouts and the shrill, insistent blare of alarms. It was the sound of a system in total collapse. Bryce, the lead engineer who had spoken with such smooth certainty just minutes ago, was frozen, his face ashen, his hands hovering uselessly over the keyboard. The algorithm had failed. The protocols were useless. His entire world, a world built on the beautiful, clean certainty of code, had crumbled into a mess of incomprehensible variables. The other technicians were equally paralyzed, their faces illuminated by the frantic red glow of the warning screens, staring as if they could will the drone to safety through sheer force of will. Victoria's voice cut through the noise, shrill with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. "Somebody do something. Manual override, anything." But no one moved. The manual controls were a legacy feature, a relic they trained on in simulators but never used in the field. It was an analog solution in a digital world, a footnote in the operating manual. To fly a multi-rotor drone of that weight and power in a wind shear of this magnitude was, according to their own risk assessment models, impossible. It required a feel, an instinct, a conversation with the wind that none of them knew how to have. They were programmers and engineers, not pilots. They spoke in Python and C++, not in the language of the sky. Silas had moved from the hangar door to the edge of the control room, drawn by the scent of unfolding disaster, a scent as familiar to him as rain on dry earth. He wasn't looking at the frantic engineers or the panicked CEO's daughter. His eyes were fixed on the main monitor, but he wasn't reading the meaningless error codes. He was watching the fragments of telemetry data that were still trickling through, the rotor pitch, the battery drain, the wind vector estimates. He saw a pattern in the chaos, a rhythm in the storm's fury that the machine could sense but not understand. His gaze then shifted to the large plate glass window, watching the way the rain slanted, the way the long grass in the field bent and flowed like water, the way a piece of loose plastic sheeting danced in the wind. He was gathering his own data, data that was millions of years older than their most advanced sensor. He understood the language of the sky because he had spent a lifetime listening to it. Victoria spun around, her wild eyes searching for a target for her rage and fear. They landed on Silas, on the old janitor standing there silently, his gaze locked on her failing dream. In that moment of her utter powerlessness, he became a symbol of everything she was trying to eradicate: old, obsolete, irrelevant. The sight of his quiet, almost contemplative focus in the midst of her technologically advanced nightmare was an unbearable insult. "What are you looking at?" she spat, her voice cracking with strain. "You think this is some kind of joke, some kind of farmer's almanac wisdom you're enjoying?" Silas didn't answer. His focus was absolute. He saw the drone dip violently on the screen, catching a vicious downdraft. He flinched, a ghost of a movement, his hands clenching at his sides as if they held an invisible yoke, his body instinctively reacting to save a craft miles away. Victoria saw the motion. The sheer, unbelievable audacity of it ignited her terror into a blaze of pure scorn. "What? You think you can fly it?" She let out a short, hysterical laugh that was closer to a sob. The idea was preposterous, an absurdity of the highest order. The janitor, the limping old man who cleaned her boots. She strode toward him, her finger jabbing at the stained fabric of his coveralls, striking his chest. "Don't you dare touch that controller. This is millions of dollars of proprietary technology. You wouldn't even know how to turn it on." Silas finally met her gaze. His eyes were calm, a deep, steady gray that seemed to absorb all the chaos in the room and reflect nothing but stillness. In their depths, a fire that had been banked for 20 years was beginning to glow. He took a single, deliberate step toward the main console, where the manual flight controller, a complex piece of hardware with twin joysticks and a dozen switches, lay untouched. Her mockery escalated, a desperate last-ditch defense of her crumbling authority. "Get away from there," she screamed, her voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Then the words tumbled out, a torrent of bitter, impossible sarcasm meant to humiliate him, to crush him, to put him back in his place as part of the scenery. "What, you think you're some kind of hero? You're going to save this thing, is that it? Fine. You land this drone in this wind. If you can land this drone, I'll marry you." The investors stared, their mouths agape. The engineers looked up from their screens, stunned into silence by the sheer, unhinged absurdity of the pronouncement. For a moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind and the frantic beeping of the dying electronics, a soundtrack to the end of a world. Silas didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He simply reached past her, his gnarled, work-worn hand closing around the cold plastic of the controller. The fit was as natural as a hawk's talon closing on a branch. And in that moment, as his fingers found their place, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if a ghost could still fly. The moment Silas's fingers wrapped around the twin joysticks of the manual controller, a profound, almost alchemical change came over him. The slight tremor in his hands, a constant companion of his age and his past, vanished. The weary slump that had curved his spine for 2 decades straightened. The limp that defined his every step seemed a distant memory as he planted his feet firmly on the polished concrete floor, finding a center of gravity he thought he had lost forever. The air around him seemed to thicken, to coalesce. He was no longer Silas the janitor, the invisible old man who faded into the background. He was someone else entirely, someone who had been dormant for a very long time, a legend sleeping in the shell of a broken man. His thumb moved with the practiced, fluid certainty of a concert pianist, flicking a small, unassuming switch on the controller. On the main console, a blaring red light blinked off, and a single line of stark white text appeared on the central screen. Autonomous flight systems disabled, manual control engaged. A collective gasp went through the room. The machine had relinquished control. Bryce, the engineer, found his voice. "Sir, you can't. The stabilization gyros are offline. The flight computer can't compensate for the wind shear without the sensor data. You're flying raw." Silas didn't seem to hear him. His focus was absolute, a channel of pure, unadulterated concentration that flowed from his mind, down his arms, and into the controller in his hands. He was no longer looking at the screen with its frantic, useless data. His eyes were fixed on the world outside the window. He wasn't flying the drone, he was reading the storm itself. He saw the way the rain hammered against the glass, not as a uniform sheet, but as a series of flowing, invisible currents and eddies. He watched the massive oak tree at the far end of the field, seeing how its thickest, oldest branches swayed in a different rhythm than its highest, most pliable limbs, a clear sign of conflicting air currents at different altitudes, a trap for any pilot, human or machine. He saw a puddle near the hangar door, its surface rippled by a sudden, violent gust that shot between the buildings, a treacherous ground-level vortex that would flip a landing drone in an instant. This was data the drone's billion-dollar sensors couldn't process. It was the knowledge of a lifetime spent in the air, a visceral, cellular understanding of how the atmosphere breathes, rages, and whispers. He eased the left stick forward, a movement of millimeters. Outside, the Harvester one, which had been bucking like a wild animal on a tether, suddenly responded. Its terrifying sideways drift toward the power line ceased. The high-pitched scream of its rotors changed pitch, deepening into a powerful, controlled hum as Silas fed power to them not equally, but in a constantly shifting pattern that matched the wind's assault. It was no longer fighting the wind. It was dancing with it. "He's got it," one of the investors, an older man named Abernathy, whispered, his voice filled with a stunned, reverent awe. Silas nudged the right stick, and the drone dipped its nose, cutting through a brutal crosswind instead of trying to power against it. It slid sideways for a terrifying moment, a maneuver so counterintuitive it made Victoria cry out. But then it stabilized, having used the gust's own ferocious energy to push itself back on its intended course. He wasn't flying a drone. He was flying a kite in a hurricane, feeling the pull and push of the strings not through fabric and twine, but through the invisible medium of radio waves and electronic signals. In the theater of his mind, the sterile control room dissolved. He was back in the cramped, vibrating cockpit of his old Grumman Agcat, the nostalgic smell of fertilizer and high-octane fuel in his nostrils, the stick alive and vibrating in his hand, the world a patchwork of green and gold below him. His body, older and more broken, still remembered the dance. He was flying by instinct, by the seat of his pants, a phrase that the young engineers in the room had probably only ever read in history books about a bygone era. He brought the drone in low, skimming just above the flattened corn stalks, a dangerous, ground-hugging approach that kept it below the worst of the shearing winds high above. The power lines loomed, spitting arcs of blue, lethal energy. With a delicate, almost imperceptible rolling movement of his thumbs, Silas made the drone climb sharply, then bank hard, letting a powerful gust of wind catch it from beneath and carry it up and over the wires with only feet to spare. It was a move of breathtaking audacity and skill, a maneuver that existed nowhere in their programming. The collective breath that everyone in the control room had been holding was released in a single, shaky sigh of disbelief. The master was at work. The ghost in the machine was no longer an algorithm. It was the spirit of a true pilot. After this, nothing would ever be the same. The investors weren't just looking at a saved piece of hardware anymore. They were looking at a man who had just defied the laws of probability, a man who represented an unknown and potentially invaluable asset. A mystery was unfolding, and the answer promised to be worth more than any drone. The final approach was the most perilous part of the flight, a crucible where a dozen variables could lead to instant disaster. The area immediately surrounding the hangar was a maelstrom of unpredictable, swirling winds bouncing off the large, flat surfaces of the buildings. To the drone's computer, it was a chaos of null data, a void where its logic ceased to function. To Silas, it was a complex but readable map of eddies and currents, a final, intricate puzzle. He saw the vortex by the hangar door, the powerful downdraft coming off the hangar roof, the slight but crucial updraft near the towering grain silo. He navigated them not as obstacles, but as stepping stones, using a current of bad air here to sidestep a downdraft there. He guided the Harvester one toward its designated landing pad, a large concrete square marked with a faded yellow H. But he wasn't aiming for the center. His experienced eyes saw how the wind was shearing across the exposed pad, a brutal, invisible cross-current that would catch the drone at its most vulnerable moment, just before touchdown. Any other pilot, human or automated, relying on instruments and standard procedure, would have flown straight into the trap. Silas didn't. Instead, in a move that made the engineer's blood run cold, he brought the drone around in a wide, graceful arc, approaching the hangar not from the front, but from the side, using the massive, 100-foot-long structure as a windbreak. It was an unconventional, completely counterintuitive approach that went against every procedure in the flight manual. Victoria opened her mouth to object, to scream that he was going to crash it into the building, but the words died in her throat. She was witnessing something that her MBA and her terabytes of data analytics could not explain. She was witnessing art, a masterpiece painted on a canvas of wind and rain. The drone hovered for a long moment, impossibly still, shielded by the hangar wall. It was just 10 feet from the building, a proximity that would have sent the automated systems into a panicked, screaming abort sequence. Silas gently eased back on the throttle, his touch on the joystick as delicate as a surgeon's. The powerful hum of the rotors softened, their pitch lowering. The drone descended, not dropping but settling as if the air itself were lowering it gently to the ground. Its landing gear touched the concrete with a barely audible click, a sound that was deafening in the charged silence of the control room. It landed inches from the barn wall, perfectly safe, its propellers spinning down into a whisper, then silence. The storm still raged around it, but the machine was home. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the control room was the drumming of the rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Everyone, the investors, the engineers, Victoria, stared at the screen, which now showed a placid, stable camera feed from the landed drone, rain beating on its lens. Then they looked at Silas. He stood with the controller held loosely in one hand, his shoulders slightly slumped again, as if the immense energy that had possessed him had now receded, leaving the old man behind. The silence in the room was deafening. It was a silence filled with shock, disbelief, and a dawning, profound respect that was almost a physical force. Bryce, the engineer, looked from the perfectly landed drone to the old man in the dirty coveralls, his expression a complex mixture of professional humiliation and pure, unadulterated wonder. He had been humbled by a wisdom that couldn't be quantified, a skill that couldn't be coded. Victoria stared at Silas, her face a pale, bloodless mask. The sarcastic bet, the cruel mockery, the the public humiliation she had so casually inflicted upon him. It all came rushing back to her, tasting like ash in her mouth. He had done the impossible. He had saved her drone, her demonstration, her reputation. And he had done it with a quiet, unassuming grace that made her own loud, brittle confidence seem childish and cheap. He had saved her. He had saved everything. And he hadn't said a single word. He had simply acted. The spell of silence was shattered not by a human voice, but by a sound that chilled everyone to the bone. A loud, explosive crack echoed from outside, sharp and violent, brutally distinct from the rumbling thunder. It was the sound of the sky striking the earth. It was followed instantly by a new alarm blaring from a different console, a high-temperature fire alert. On a secondary monitor, a security camera feed flickered to life, showing the top of the main grain silo. A plume of thick, oily black smoke was billowing from a ventilation cap. The lightning strike hadn't been a harmless flash of light. It had found a path to ground through the silo's metal structure, and in doing so, had ignited the fine, highly combustible grain dust suspended in the air near the top. "Fire in Silo 1, an engineer yelled, his voice cracking with fresh panic. The strike must have flash-ignited the grain dust near the peak. Panic, which had just begun to subside, erupted anew, but this time it was colder, sharper, and more primal. A grain silo fire was a farmer's worst nightmare. It wasn't just a fire, it was a bomb. If the fine, suspended dust inside the confined space caught fire in a chain reaction, the entire structure could detonate with the force of a conventional explosive, a fuel-air bomb that would take the new hangar and everything in it along for the ride. The crisis had just escalated from financial loss to a threat of total annihilation. The storm had delivered its second blow. "Call the fire department," Victoria commanded, her voice regaining its sharp edge of authority, a familiar port in a storm of chaos. "Already did," Bryce responded, his voice tight, his fingers already dialing. "They're volunteer. Best case, they're 15 minutes out from the station. With these roads, it's too long. Way too long." The smoke pouring from the silo vent was growing thicker, darker, a malevolent genie being released from its bottle. They were watching a multi-million-dollar catastrophe unfold in slow, inexorable motion. The investors were already backing away toward the exit, their faces grim masks of self-preservation. This was no longer a demonstration of futuristic profits. It was a live view of a total, catastrophic loss. But Silas wasn't looking at the investors or the panicked engineers. His eyes were on the drone, sitting placidly on the concrete, and then at a pallet in the corner of the hangar. On it were several large, red canisters marked with a biohazard symbol. They contained an experimental, high-adhesion fire suppressant foam, a proprietary Vance Agritech product designed to be loaded into the drone sprayer payload for combating agricultural fires. It was a system that was still in the beta testing phase, not yet approved for active use, its efficacy unproven outside of a lab. He looked at the drone. He looked at the fire. He looked at the 15-minute gap where everything they had built could turn to ash and twisted metal. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the control room, his limp suddenly more pronounced, as if the weight of his next decision was settling back into his bones. He was moving toward the storm, not away from it. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for help. The others watched, stunned into inaction, as he strode out into the lashing rain and wind. He went straight to the drone, his old hands working with a familiar, methodical speed that defied his age. He unlatched the pesticide tank and, with a grunt of pure physical effort, disconnected the hoses, spilling residual chemicals that sizzled on the wet concrete. He then wrestled one of the heavy fire suppressant canisters from the pallet, his face a mask of grim, focused determination. The canister wasn't designed for a quick swap. The fittings were different, a deliberate design choice to prevent misuse. It was a problem that would take an engineering team an hour and a specialized toolkit to solve. Silas had neither. He pulled a battered multi-tool from his coverall pocket. With a few deft twists and a grunt of force, he broke the proprietary locking mechanism on the drone's payload mount. He used a length of safety wire from his maintenance cart to lash the canister's nozzle directly to the drone's sprayer output, jury-rigging a connection that was crude, ugly, but functional. It was the kind of on-the-fly improvisation that algorithms couldn't dream of. It was a farmer's fix, born of necessity and experience. He jogged back into the control room, dripping wet, his gray hair plastered to his scalp, looking more like a drowned rat than a savior. He picked up the controller again. Every eye in the room was on him. "You can't," Bryce stammered, his mind racing through the dozens of protocols the old man was violating. "The payload weight is unbalanced. The viscosity of the foam is different from the pesticide. The flight computer won't clear it for takeoff. It will auto-abort." Silas's thumb had already flicked the switch. Manual control engaged. He didn't need the computer's permission. He powered up the rotors, their hum quickly rising to a roar that battled the sound of the storm itself. Through the sensitive feedback of the controller, he could feel the imbalance, a slight, dangerous wobble that would tear the machine apart if not managed. He compensated for it instinctively, feeding a little more power to the rotors on the heavy side, his thumbs making 1,000 unconscious micro-adjustments per second. The drone lifted off the ground, tilting precariously for a heart-stopping moment before Silas wrestled it into a stable, if strained, hover. He sent it soaring upward, a silver and white blur against the bruised purple sky. He didn't have the luxury of a gentle, cautious approach. He flew it with a controlled aggression, a desperate urgency, pushing it through the wind and rain toward the smoking silo. This task required a different kind of skill than the landing. This wasn't about grace. It was about surgical precision under immense life-or-death pressure. He had to get the nozzle of the improvised sprayer directly over the silo's narrow ventilation cap, a target no bigger than a dinner plate, 50 feet in the air, in the middle of a gale, with a machine that was actively trying to tear itself apart. On the monitor, they watched his camera feed. The world pitched and yawed violently. The silo grew closer, its corrugated metal walls a rain-slicked blur. The smoke was thick, acrid, obscuring the target. Then, with a final, masterful adjustment, the drone stopped, hovering directly above the vent. It held its position against the wind with a tenacity that seemed impossible, its rotors screaming in protest. Silas's finger moved to a different button on the controller, one that activated the payload sprayer. "Now," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, a prayer to the gods of machinery. He pressed it. A thick, white stream of foam erupted from the drone, shooting downward like a lance into the heart of the fire. He didn't just dump the whole canister. He pulsed it, short, controlled bursts, forcing the foam deep into the silo's peak, smothering the flames at their source without adding too much sudden weight to the structure. After 10 agonizing seconds, he stopped. The plume of black smoke thinned, turning gray, then white with steam. A moment later, it was gone. He had done it. He had put out the fire. He brought the drone back, landing it with the same gentle precision as before, the now empty canister still wired crudely to its underbelly. In the distance, the wail of a fire truck siren could just be heard, a sound that now signaled an arrival to a crisis that was already over. The battle was won, but Silas had a chilling feeling that the war was just beginning. The silence returned, deeper and more profound this time. It was the silence of a miracle witnessed, of a reality fundamentally altered. One of the investors, the older man with a weathered face named Abernathy, who had been in the agricultural business for 50 years and had seen it all, stepped forward, his eyes wide with something more than just amazement. He was staring at the flight path replay on one of the secondary monitors, a glowing green line that showed the drone's sharp climb and banking turn over the power lines. "That maneuver," Abernathy said, his voice raspy with disbelief, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "The way it used the wind's own energy to gain altitude coming out of that turn, I've only ever seen one pilot fly like that. It was his signature." He turned his gaze from the screen to Silas, who was quietly wiping his hands on a rag, the controller resting on the console beside him like a discarded tool. They called it the Silas loop, a move of pure, beautiful insanity. I haven't seen that since the National Crop Dusting Championships of '98. Abernathy's eyes narrowed, a flicker of a long-dormant memory igniting within them. That pilot's name was Silas Blackwood, best damn stick-and-rudder man I ever saw, a legend, but he disappeared after that crash in '99, a bad one. They said he lost his farm, lost his nerve. They said he might as well have died in the wreckage. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire silent room. "My God, it's you, isn't it? You're Silas Blackwood." All eyes in the room turned to the old man, the janitor, the ghost, the maintenance man. Victoria felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid concrete floor beneath her had turned to sand. The name Blackwood was a legend in the old farming circles, a name her own father had mentioned with a mixture of reverence and pity. A name synonymous with a kind of aerial artistry, a pure, seat-of-the-pants genius that had died with the advent of GPS and automated flight. She had dismissed that entire era and the men who defined it as antiquated, irrelevant. And its greatest living master had been mopping her floors, had been kneeling to clean her boots. Silas finally looked up, his gaze meeting Abernathy's. The wall of anonymity he had carefully constructed around himself for 2 decades was crumbling, breached by the events of the last hour. The memories, held at bay for years by the quiet, monotonous routine of his life, came flooding back, not as a trickle, but as a tidal wave. He looked at the drone, then at the rain-streaked window, and for the first time in 20 years he spoke of the past. His voice was low and gravelly, unused to holding the attention of a room. "The farm wasn't the only thing I lost that day," he began, his gaze distant, seeing not the high-tech control room but a field of burning wheat under a smoke-choked summer sky. "The crash, it was my fault. Pushing the plane too hard, trying to beat a storm just like this one. Came down in my own South 40. Broke my leg, my hip, a few ribs." He unconsciously touched his right hip, where the old injury still ached with the memory of shattered bone. But that wasn't the worst of it. The plane burned. Woke up in the hospital a week later. The bank called. Insurance wouldn't cover it, said I flew into unsafe conditions, violated the policy. An act of God, they called it. They called my loan. Everything my father and his father had built, gone, just like that. He snapped his fingers, a quiet, brittle sound that echoed the breaking of a bloodline. He paused, the weight of the memory heavy and suffocating in the air. I couldn't fly anymore. Every time I looked at the sky, I saw the smoke. I heard the engine screaming, the sound of my own failure, so I walked away, changed my name. Figured if I couldn't be in the air, I could at least be near the land, smelling the soil, watching things grow. It was a kind of penance. He looked around the room, at the stunned faces of the engineers and investors. He wasn't speaking to them, not really, but to himself, finally giving voice to the ghosts that had haunted his long, silent life. I took this job because it was quiet. No one knew me. I could just be. I watched you build all this, he said, gesturing to the gleaming technology around them. I watched your computers and your sensors. You were all trying so hard to take the risk out of it, to take the pilot out of the cockpit. But the sky doesn't care about your code. It has a language, and today it started speaking. I just remembered how to listen. He turned his gaze to Victoria. There was no anger in his eyes, no triumph. Only a deep, resonant sadness. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I saw a good piece of machinery about to get wrecked by a storm, and then I saw a fire that was going to burn down a good barn and a full silo. It's not in a farmer's nature to stand by and watch things burn when you can do something about it. That's all it was. His explanation was so simple, so profound in its lack of ego, that it stripped away all the complexity and drama of the day, leaving only a core, unshakable truth. He had acted not for glory or reward, but out of a fundamental, almost sacred respect for the tools and the land itself. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer filled with shock, but with a deep, humbling, and for some, deeply unsettling understanding. A man like this couldn't be controlled, couldn't be bought. And in their world, that made him the most dangerous thing of all. Victoria Vance felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling away beneath her feet. Everything she believed in, the supremacy of data, the inevitable efficiency of automation, the inherent superiority of her modern, educated worldview, had been systematically dismantled in the space of 30 minutes by a quiet old man with a mop. The humiliation she now felt was 1,000 times more profound than the trivial annoyance of muddy boots. It was the elemental shame of discovering that her entire map of the world was wrong, that she had been navigating by a false star. She looked at Silas Blackwood, truly seeing him for the first time. The man, not the function. She saw the lines etched on his face, not as signs of age, but as a topographical map of a life lived in the sun and wind. She saw the calluses on his hands, not as the marks of a menial laborer, but as the hard-won credentials of a master. She saw the limp in his walk, not as a weakness, but as the permanent scar of a battle he had survived. Her own arrogance was a repulsive thing to her now. A cheap, gaudy armor she had worn to hide the terrifying insecurity that she was nothing without her father's name and money. She had stood on her platform and preached about the obsolescence of men like him, while the greatest living practitioner of the very art her technology sought to replace was standing right behind her, invisible, silent, and judging. She stepped forward, her movement slow, uncertain, as if walking in a dream. The investors and her team parted for her, creating a path. She stopped directly in front of Silas, the vast, unbridgeable difference in their stations, CEO's daughter and janitor, now an absurd fiction. In the world that mattered, the world of real skill and tangible results, he was the titan, and she was the novice. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice barely a whisper. It cracked with an emotion she couldn't identify. It was shame, regret, and a powerful, overwhelming wave of respect that felt like a physical force. I am so sorry. For everything, for my arrogance, for how I treated you." Her eyes welled with tears, not of self-pity, but of genuine, gut-wrenching remorse. "What you did today, I have no words for it." She took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of her corporate self, falling back on the only language she knew: problem-solving and acquisition. "This company, Vance Agri-Tech, we need you, I need you. I was wrong. The technology isn't enough. It needs a soul, it needs your experience. I want to offer you a position, not just a job, a department. You can build it from the ground up. Head of aviation and special operations. You write your own ticket, name your salary. You can teach our pilots, redesign our training protocols, please." It was the ultimate corporate apology, an offer of power and money. She was trying to right a social wrong with a financial solution. To her, it was the highest honor she could bestow. She was offering him a place at her table, a seat in the world from which he had been so brutally exiled. The entire room watched, waiting for his answer. It seemed a foregone conclusion. Who would refuse such an offer? Who would choose a mop and bucket over a corner office and a six-figure salary? It was a choice between being a ghost and being a king. Silas looked at the earnest, pleading face of the young woman before him. He saw her apology for what it was, sincere, if misguided. She thought the solution to his pain was a title and a paycheck. He looked at the controller, still sitting on the console, a symbol of the power and prestige she was offering him. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, he allowed himself to imagine it. The respect, the title, the chance to fly again, to be the master once more, to hear the name Silas Blackwood spoken with awe instead of pity. The ghost of the champion stirred within him, hungry for recognition. Then he looked past her through the large window at the gray, rain-washed sky. The storm had passed. The sky was calm again, scrubbed clean. He had faced its fury and won. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had no desire to ever command it again. That part of his life was over. He had made his peace with it today, not by reclaiming his throne, but by using his gift one last time for a simple, honest purpose. To save something worth saving. He slowly shook his head. He reached out, not for a handshake to seal a deal, and picked up the controller. His hands were steady. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its potential. Then, with a quiet finality, he gently placed it back into Victoria's hands. Her fingers closed around it, the plastic feeling alien and inert to her. It was just an object without the soul to guide it. "I don't want your job," Silas said, his voice soft but firm, carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. "And with all due respect, ma'am, I don't want to marry you either." A few of the younger engineers stifled a nervous cough, breaking the tension. He turned his gaze toward the mess of equipment, the overturned secondary drone, the mud tracked in from outside. "I just didn't want to see good machinery burn, or a good barn go up in smoke. There's a difference between flying for a trophy and flying to save a harvest. I'm done with the first kind." With that, he turned away from her, from the stunned investors, from the silent, awestruck engineers. He walked over to his forgotten maintenance cart. The squeak of its wheels on the polished floor was the only sound. He picked up his mop, the wooden handle worn smooth and familiar in his grip. He dipped it into the bucket of murky water, wrung it out with a practiced twist, and began to clean the floor, starting with the muddy footprints near the door. He was erasing the evidence of the storm, restoring order, doing his job. He was Silas, the maintenance man, and for the first time in 20 years he was content. Victoria stood frozen, the heavy controller in her hands feeling like a useless, hollow weight. She watched him work, his movements slow, deliberate, peaceful. The world had just offered him a throne, and he had chosen his mop. He hadn't refused her offer out of pride or anger. He had refused it because it was utterly irrelevant to him. He didn't need her validation. He didn't need a title or a salary to know who he was. He had a purpose, and it was a purpose he had chosen for himself, on his own terms, in the quiet dignity of his self-imposed exile. The investors began to talk in low, excited whispers, Abernathy already on his phone, no doubt recounting the legend he had just seen brought to life. Her engineers were huddled around the console, looking at the flight data not with the eyes of programmers checking for bugs, but with the reverence of students before a master. A new kind of energy filled the room, an excitement born not from a successful product demo, but from witnessing something genuinely human and profound. But Victoria only saw the old man with the mop. She finally understood. You could program a machine to follow a flight path. You could give it sensors to read the wind. You could write 1,000,000 lines of code to account for 1,000 variables. But you couldn't code instinct. You couldn't program a lifetime of knowledge gained from the feel of the wind on your face. You couldn't upload a soul. She had been so obsessed with building a perfect, sterile future that she had forgotten that the most valuable assets are often imperfect, scarred and forged in the failures of the past. The lesson was brutal and it was beautiful. Experience cannot be coded. As she watched Silas, a new resolve hardened within her. She had been given a gift, a glimpse of a deeper truth. Now she had to decide what to do with it, and she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that her father would never understand. The real storm was yet to come. A few months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the air smelling of turned earth and drying leaves, Victoria Vance walked away from the main complex, leaving the hum of servers and the chatter of her team behind. She wore simple work boots, scuffed and dusty, and a flannel shirt over a plain t-shirt. She found Silas not in the main hangar, but in a small, forgotten workshop at the far edge of the property, a place that smelled of oil, old wood, and time. He was sitting on a stool, meticulously cleaning the parts of a small, two-stroke engine spread out on a clean rag on his workbench. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded and gestured to another stool. She sat. They were quiet for a long time. The only sounds the metallic click of Silas's tools and the distant cawing of crows. "The board promoted me," she said finally, her voice flat. "Full oversight of the entire R&D division. They called the incident a successful stress test of experimental protocols under extreme weather conditions." She gave a short, humorless laugh that sounded like breaking twigs. "They credited me with your success. Said I showed exemplary crisis management by empowering on-site personnel." Silas didn't look up from his work, carefully scraping carbon from a piston head. "That's the way of it. A story needs a hero they can understand. I told them the truth," she continued, her voice quiet but intense. "I told them it was all you, that our system failed and you saved us. They didn't care. They just liked the story they could sell. The stock went up 12%. He finally paused, wiping a gear with a clean rag. He looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to see right through the corporate titles and the family name, to the uncertain young woman beneath. "What do you care about, Victoria?" The question was simple, direct, and it cut her to the core. What asterisk did asterisk she care about? The stock price, the title, the approval of her father and a board of faceless men who saw the world as a balance sheet. She looked down at her own hands, clean and uncalloused. "I want to learn," she said, the admission costing her more than she could have imagined. It was an admission of inadequacy, of ignorance. "I don't want to be the person I was. I want to understand what you understand." Silas studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. He then picked up a small, intricately shaped piece of metal from his workbench. "You know what this is?" She shook her head. "It's a magneto impulse coupling from an old crop duster. It's what makes the spark that starts the engine. It's purely mechanical. The new engines, they have computers for that. Electronic ignition. It's more efficient. 99% of the time, it's better." He turned the small, heavy, mechanical part over in his palm. "But if you get hit by lightning, the computer fries. The whole system goes dead. This..." He tapped the metal piece with his fingernail, making it ring with a clear, sharp note. "This just keeps on spinning. It doesn't know it's supposed to fail." He placed the small piece of metal in her hand. It was heavy, solid, real, an anchor in a world of abstractions. "You've built a fine engine, Victoria, a powerful one. Don't forget to give it a soul." She closed her hand around the magneto coupling, the cold metal warming against her skin. It felt like a promise, a beginning. She finally understood. He hadn't just saved a drone that day. He had saved her. He had given her back a piece of the world she had tried so desperately to discard. A world of grit, wisdom, and the simple, profound dignity of a job well done. It was a lesson worth more than any inheritance, and a weapon she would need for the war to come. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. The greatest wisdom is often found in the quietest corners, and true strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to bear them. But as one person breaks free from the system they built, what happens to the ones who built the system itself, those who believe its code is law? As one man's experience rewrites the rules, what becomes of the rule makers who are left behind, fighting to protect their fragile, perfect world? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.